this, Ali, and I think it's probably useful if we just go through the questions. That should cover everything. And obviously, please feel free to interrupt. अगर मैं कुछ कह रहा हूँ जो समझ नहीं आ रही or you have additional questions, follow on. Just unmute yourselves and sort of chime in. So the first question, does everyone have a spreadsheet of the questions, by the way? I should check.
Let me just send it in the chat so everyone doesn't have access to it. Just one moment.
Do you want to just do that so everyone can see this? Okay, so the first question was, how do you weigh up two reasonably well-analyzed impacts when the teams have not weighed them explicitly, especially in diagonals? So good question. I think there are a few things that come into here, and this is sort of covering how you make good arguments as well, I guess. When analyzed impacts will never be equally well analyzed. I guess it goes without saying. And the two or three things to note is one, the probability of it actually happening. Like, what are the odds that the impacts actually occur, right? So, for instance, I guess two impacts that you can be comparing is, one side says nuclear war happens, and the other side says, well, 100,000 people die. Nuclear war is obviously worse, arguably, than 100,000 people dying, but if the probability of that happening is infinitely low, it's 0.01%, but 100,000 people are definitely going to die. So I guess that's sort of one way of weighing up the impacts on each side. Like, what is the probability? Like, what are the reasons given for why this will actually happen? So Aksar teams like at the end, they'll just go in and say, this is really bad if it occurs, but they forget to prove the premise of the argument, which is that this will actually happen, not just that it is bad if it does. So that's the first, which is the probability of it happening. The second is how bad actually is the impact, right? So, for instance, if we're talking about standard intervention debate, right, we're saying boots on the ground in Syria or Libya or whatever, and an argument comes up about we should oppose intervention because intervention will lead to collateral damage, right? Innocent people will die. That's fine, that's fair enough, but there are two versions of this argument. One is just when you say innocent people will die, collateral damage is inevitable, and the other is where you go into a lot more depth and you explain, look, militant organizations often use human shields or live in civilian buildings or make them as base camps. So in order to target those, you end up having to kill innocent people. It's difficult to tell the difference between different groups on the ground. So you provide a lot more reasons as to why, as to how likely, as to sort of the extent of the collateral damage. So I guess that's the second one. The first is probability, and the second is the extent of the damage. And I guess the third way of assessing it is who are we talking about, right? So if Prop comes up and says in a debate, and they say, the incomes of middle class families will go down because of this policy, and opposition says, sure, but we don't really care that much because this policy will lead to significant improvements in the incomes of lower income families, right? Now, this is obviously being very basic and very crude here, but intuitively you can say, look, we probably care more about those who are from lower income families. They're worse off, they have less money, they probably need the help of the state much more than middle class families do. So the question then becomes of which actor are we talking about? Hum kiski baat kar rahe hain? Who do we care more about? Because the impacts can be equal, income decreasing as much as income increases for another group, but the people who we are talking about can be very different, right? Some matter more than others in any given debate. So those are sort of the three ways in which you would weigh up an impact: the probability of the impact happening, the extent of the impact, and sort of who the impact is actually on. Like, do we care more about those groups than we care about other groups in society? So I guess that's the first question of first part of the question of how do you weigh up two opposing impacts. The question on sort of especially in diagonals, wali jo baat hai, so it is a higher burden on closing teams to weigh their arguments against opening teams simply because opening have not had the opportunity to do so, right? They've made their arguments first. They could never have made the comparison in the first place, whereas bottom half teams have seen the arguments. It's on them. So I think this is a bit lazy. I'll concede this is a bit lazy, but I think we all judges do this at some point. When it becomes super close, super tight, and there really does not seem an obvious way of weighing up two arguments, like, they just sort of, for all intents and purposes, they seem equally strong. Judges tend to default to the opening team simply because the closing team never made the effort of comparing when it is, again, a higher burden on them, simply because, they've come afterwards. So that's a bit lazy judging. Ideally, you should always try and find a way of explaining why one argument won out on the other. In the event that you can't, and something that happens, sometimes teams are equally strong, and their arguments just match up perfectly well. In which instance, you often end up defaulting towards the opening. I think some of the things that end up mattering, the points of information, if they were taken from the opening teams, were they able to effectively challenge the closing teams? So those sorts of things can factor in. But otherwise, I think the last thing I'd say on the diagonal front is, so if you're weighing up OG and CO, for instance, right? It doesn't matter what OO said. Like, koi farak nahi padta. OO could have been the best team in the room, but what OO said to respond to OG does not make a difference to the weighing of the diagonal. And I think we'll come on to this later on as well. Okay, that's sort of my answer to the first question. Does anyone have any questions on that? Everyone clear?
I had a small one regarding what if the closing half doesn't take POIs, like from their diagonal, like how much of that is affected if it's really close?
Yeah, so I think, ultimately it doesn't matter, right? So there's one caveat to that. We'll come on to that in a second, but ultimately you can't penalize a team for not taking POIs. I often want to penalize them. There's an argument for why you maybe should penalize them, but the rules are such, you shouldn't penalize a team for not taking POIs or not taking POIs from the opening team. They can take it from whoever they want. So ultimately it doesn't matter all that much. But again, when it becomes super close between two teams on the diagonal, right? I often say, look, guys, it was super close. The extent to which you could have weighed it up, you didn't weigh it up, but equally you didn't allow opening government to respond to you. You didn't allow them the opportunity to engage back, right? So I think when it becomes super close, it can be a factor that goes into it. But ultimately, the lack of a POI will never be determinative of a call, I think. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Cool. Anyone else on sort of this question? No. Okay. So second one, what constitutes as a knife? Good question, I guess. Yes, so in its most Taha Iqbal is saying, can you respond? On its most basic sense, a knife is just when a closing team contradicts an opening team, right? And by contradiction, I want to make clear, it's not an inconsistency of sorts. It's not a what if scenario. It's very explicitly a contradiction. To the extent that only one of the two arguments, one from opening government, one from closing government, only one of them can be true at the same time, right? So it's a direct contradiction. So that's sort of what a knife is. I guess in as much as how to judge a knife. So this happens very rarely, I think, in debates. But sometimes you'll have an opening government or opening opposition, they go completely crazy. Which is to say that they'll completely misunderstand the motion and they'll set up a bizarre mechanism. Now, if you're looking at that opening government team and you're saying, this makes absolutely no sense. What I would do, and I think some judges perhaps disagree, but what I would do in that instance is I would give closing government a bit more leeway in that instance. I would allow them to set up something that is a bit more sensible. That's one. The second thing I would say is sometimes teams just set up dumb arguments or dumb cases in open government. In that instance, closing government is just a bit screwed, right? It's unfortunate, but closing government has to debate within the parameters set up by opening government. No matter, and they can't just say, either coffee dumb, it was a dumb sort of setup, or it was a really bad argument to run, so we want to run something different. That's not enough, right? It's only sort of in the extreme situations where an opening government just goes off so far left field. I think for judgment call, obviously, like, people's interpretation of how crazy a setup of a debate will inevitably differ. But I think it should be obvious on the face of it when a team goes so far away from the motion that you're like, okay, this doesn't make sense. I think that you should be very cautious in doing that, like cautious in allowing CG to set up or move away from the world that opening government is talking about. The reason for that is because opposing team, it's unfair to them. So if you think about it, opening government sets up a crazy world which makes no sense to anyone. Like literally, they start speaking and everyone's eyebrows goes up, and you're like, what is this, right? OO has no choice but to engage with that case, right? So they spend a lot of time responding to that case and then building their arguments around that. Okay, the closing government at the end, they set up something radically different. How do you end up comparing that to OO? Right? It's a very difficult question. I think it would depend on the debate. But that's why you should be very cautious in allowing people to sort of, allowing people to say, yeah, opening government case, what else could we have done? Right? So it's really a very high bar for opening teams to go so crazy that the closing teams can sort of depart. Otherwise, the way if a knife happens, assuming it's sort of in most knives a knife happens, what you should do is you should just discard that specific argument. So let's say closing government runs 3 arguments. One is a knife, right? One is just very clearly a knife. It's in direct contradiction to something opening government said. You discard that specific argument. That does not mean they get the automatic fourth. They don't get the automatic fourth. There are no automatic fourths or firsts or second or thirds in debating, right? So what you then do is you just look at the other 2 the arguments, and then you weigh them up against opening government and the rest of the teams. You just discount the ones that are in direct contradiction. Does that make sense to everyone? There are sort of any questions on that one?
Sir, I have a follow-up question. So I was recently in this debate where the motion was this House believes that morality should revolve around X. O says no, it should revolve around Y. So as closing, if you say that, all right, our opening government said that morality should revolve around X, but we think it should revolve around Z. Is that a knife? Like just saying, because it's not really a mech, but it's also not following what OG said. So,
but you said the motion was that morality revolves around X, right?
Sorry, the motion was that morality should not revolve around X. OG says it should revolve around Y. O says no, it should still revolve around X. And CG says ke nahi. Sab chodo, like there's this new Z we wanted to revolve around.
I don't think that's a knife. The reason for that is, so the argument is morality should not revolve around X, right? But it doesn't specify what it should revolve around. Opening government can say it should revolve around A, and closing government can say it should revolve around something completely different. That is, yeah, I mean, I see your point. Right? That's sort of somewhat inconsistent, but I don't think that will constitute. That would necessarily constitute a knife. I think that should actually be okay. That should be fine.
All right, got it. Thanks.
Right. Third question: how much new analysis impacting can we credit from whip speakers? Is there a different standard for GovWhip and UpWhip? No, there's no different standard for GovWhip and UpWhip. It's sort of the same standard for both. How much new analysis impacting can we credit from whip speakers? Yeah, so I think the rule is no new information from whip speakers. Now, there's no sort of black line, right, where everything cuts off. It really does vary. It does depend, and I think some judges are a bit more lenient, some are more strict. But essentially, the way I look at it, so new responses or rebuttals are completely fine. I have no issue with that. New weighing up, right? So what I mean by that is, whip speaker coming up and saying, okay, actually, मेरे partner ने की जो तीसरी argument थी वो सबसे जरूरी थी. That was the third argument was the most important, not the first one. Fine, don't have an issue with that. You can reprioritize your case as you want to. No issues. Where the problem starts, where the whip speaker starts adding to the argument, right? And I guess you should think about 2 things. The first is this a line of analysis that was not at all? So one is a very obvious area, which is this is an entirely new argument, right? Ye to whip extension speaker ne kaha hi nahi tha. This just was not present in the extension speaker, right? So it's an entirely new argument. You discard that completely, and you listen to everything else the speaker was saying. That's one. 2, it's the same argument that their partner ran in extension, but they're building on it, right? They're just sort of saying a few new, they're adding a few new lines. Now, it gets a bit tricky, right? So sometimes what happens is the whip speakers are just sort of completing lines of analysis, right? They're just sort of making the obvious conclusion of what has already been said. So coming back to the collateral damage argument, for instance, let's say if the extension speaker says 4 or 5 things, 4 or 5 reasons as to why lots of collateral will happen, and the whip then comes up and says, and kind of makes the concluding statements of, look, my partner told you all these reasons why collateral damage will occur, and they say something like, as a result of lots of people dying, this is going to result in negative sentiment, which will backfire on the intervening force. Now that, if you think about it, is sort of a concluding statement, but it's actually a new statement, right? So it's an entirely new impact, right? Which is the collateral damage will result in negative sentiment towards the intervening force and the consequences of that. That is not allowed. वो आप नहीं कर सकते, right? So you have to be very careful. I think, and the advice I give to people when they ask the opposite question of this, which is how to get away with new information in whip speech, is some people just lie. You know, they just lie that their partner said this, and some people do that very well sometimes. And the other thing I suggest is ways in which you couch information, which is to say, you know, if your partner said 4 reasons, right? When you're repeating those reasons, you just say, look, here's an extra reason. You don't say the words, here's an extra reason. You just provide the extra reason in the middle of the argument that you are sort of re-explaining to the judge, right? So it kind of looks like that was somewhere in each of your partners. So you kind of make it look like abjud bolte, basically. And you know, that's just sort of on you how well you take your notes and how well you're able to spot that. But I think a lot of people do try and fit information. I think I'm pretty harsh when it comes to new information in whips. Like I think if you gave 4 reasons in extension and then whip is giving a 5th one, I don't know. I usually don't allow it. I'm like, oh, this isn't new. This shouldn't happen. But yeah, in general, sort of that, you know, you should go for new rebuttals, new weighing up, and all that sort of stuff, but not new positive substance. Any questions on that? None. Okay. If closing teams do not take POIs from their diagonals, how do we factor that in when making the diagonal comparison? Yeah, so I think Essen asked this earlier as well. You know, I think POIs are not determinative. I think maybe schools system pay the 3-on-3 school circuit, they pay more attention to this, and there are specific points for POIs. But BB may, you know, it's not determinative. It really is good practice to take POIs. It's good form, but it's not going to be determinative if you did not take one. So yeah, that's sort of the obvious answer to that question. Next, to what extent should, same question, the one after that, if opening and closing identify different stakeholders but impact them equally well, how do I weigh one over the other? Yeah, so I think this sort of comes back to, so it depends on what impacting stakeholders mean, right? So one version is that they can explain equally well the harms or benefits to the different groups in society, right? That's fine. But then there's a secondary question of which group do we care more about, right? So you can have proportional benefits to, let's say, upper and working class, proportional harm to the upper class and the benefits to the working class, but you can make intuitive arguments as to why you should care about those who are near the bottom of the society than the top. So I think that's sort of one way in which you would weigh them up. And then if that doesn't work, right, if that doesn't work, then you kind of go back to what I was saying in the first question, which is, you know, how likely are the things to happen? It's very rare that the arguments are literally just going to be, you know, like exact same in strength. There will be something that is a bit weak or a bit strong about one side. So does that make sense? You kind of weigh them up on who the actor is at, and whether society should care more about them. Any questions on that? Nope. Cool. What is the preferred note-taking technique? How do you arrange your papers? Do you have a separate OA sheet? Yeah, so there's no sort of set note-taking technique. I guess it goes without saying. Everyone does it very differently. I'm sure you guys would have seen some judges take very few notes. I mean, I have some friends who will come out of a debate and will have just one, maybe, you know, just one page, in which they would have written maybe like 15 sentences, and that's it. So everyone does it differently. The way I take notes is I usually have 2 pieces of paper, each sort of divided into 4 sections, and then one piece will be sort of, you know, Prime Minister, Leader of Opposition, Deputy Prime Minister, Deputy Leader of Opposition, and then on the second page, the same for the 4 closing speakers. And then I usually have a third page, which I will just sort of roughly divide into, again, 4 sections. And what I do there is, in each section, for opening governments, I'll just write down the title of their arguments. Right, like if they ran 4 arguments, I'll just write what the 4 arguments are. I'll skip over the detail. I'll just write what the arguments are. I'll do the same for OO, do the same for CG, do the same for CO. The reason that helps me is because often teams tend to say a lot of stuff, but what I find when I'm judging is that not a lot of it matters when it comes to deciding who's beaten whom. Actually, only there's always this one, maybe 1.5 or 2 arguments that actually end up determining who wins, and a lot of the other stuff just becomes a bit of faff that is not strong enough to win or decide the case. So what happens with me is, if I've, let's say on my third piece of paper, if I've got OG's 4 arguments and OO's 3 arguments, and then I'm going through I'm like looking at my detailed notes, and I've decided, OG's first argument actually got beaten pretty strongly by opening opposition. I'll just put a cross mark on my third sheet, right? I'll say that argument didn't count. So now we've got 3 arguments from OG, 3 arguments for O, and I'll just sort of go through, right? And if there's an argument from opening government, let's say, that I thought was actually mitigated very well by opening opposition but wasn't taken out, then I'll just make a quick note on the third sheet saying, here were the things that were said to mitigate it, so it became significantly weaker. And sometimes what happens is, when I put, if I'm confused, it's not immediately obvious to me who won in a particular clash, I'll look at my third sheet and I'll say, actually, if I think about it, closing opposition only gave me 1 argument. And even then it wasn't that strong. So they lose, as an example. So what happens is, some teams will say so much, but then you're always a bit unsure. Was this new? Was this powerful? I was a bit confused. So when you're forced to write down just the taglines of each argument, right? The main important thing in the argument on a separate piece of paper, you're forced to sort of crystallize their case, like just sort of make it clear for yourself, and then it becomes actually. So that's how I take my notes, and that helps me. Do people have questions on how if I've explained that well, or do people want to ask questions on how they do it, etc.? Anyone have any questions?
Asad, I have one. Do you add to your third sheet during the debate, and then do you process that information that, all right, O is taking this clash or OG during the debate, or do you do it after, especially after you don't have that much time?
I do it during the debate. I think, so during the debate, I think the one very good advice I was given, and it really has helped me, is when the fourth speaker in the debate, so when deputy leader of opposition sits down, you should know who won on the top half. You won't always. If the debate is very difficult to judge, neither will I. But 90% of the time, you should know who won top half. And then CG extension speaker gets up, gives their speech, sits down. You should have a very strong idea of what happened on gov half, right? The reason that's true is because ultimately the way you compare opening government and closing government is by looking at their substantive material. I don't get a positive case. You're not really looking at the rebuttals, right? So to that extent, there's some room for the call changing, absolutely, because the whip can come in and the whip can prove why their partner's material was significantly stronger or more important in a variety of ways than opening governments. But just on the face of it, like on the face of closing government's new arguments, you can have a call. So for instance, if closing government comes up and say, and they sit down and you think, actually, there's hardly anything new here, you will obviously be like, okay, fine, opening government beats closing government, right? But you should be making that call as you go along. If you're unsure as to what's happened, then you wait for the whip speaker to come up. And then the whip speaker gives their speech, they sit down. When they've sat down, you should have in your mind, I think this is how it went. And then obviously I'm on the diagonal. So make the calls as you go along. I write on the third sheet as I go along, just because it gets a bit confusing and it's sort of less fresh in my mind by the end of the debate. Any other questions? Cool. Agla, how do you weigh up 2 distinct principal arguments, particularly when teams have not explicitly weighed up themselves? Yeah. Good question. I think there's no specific rule about principal arguments. I think the answer to this would apply to any 2 distinct arguments when the teams haven't weighted up themselves. Which is to say, if you genuinely think, you both rarely hota, but if you genuinely think that the 2 principal arguments are just equally powerful, equally nuanced, equally well made, there's really very little to differentiate between them, right? In that very rare circumstance, there is nothing you can do but weigh in yourself. That's and the one thing I would say is I'm very honest in my feedback when I'm giving the decision and explaining my call. I will say, if that happens, that guys, look, you had 2 very good arguments, but you just did not bother to weigh them up against each other. And we tried very hard, but we just had no way of calling one for the other, in which instance the panel had to intervene, and this is the side they came on. I think that should really be a last scenario. Like, you should really look for something in there. I think if the two principal arguments are that close, you can call them a wash and then base the debate on everything else that went on, right? You can say, look, guys, you had one principal argument on your side, one on the other, both very strong, couldn't differentiate, it became a wash. We thought both were equally important, so the debate was actually judged on what else was said, right? जो बाकी arguments जो थी, whether वो principal हो या practical हो. And I think that should be your preferred option, right? If you genuinely cannot weigh up two arguments, you should refer to everything else that's been said in the debate. And if it just happens that really these two teams only had these principal arguments going for them, then you have no choice but to intervene. I think obviously the masla ye aata hai your own beliefs are determining who's winning, because you may have more sympathy for one principal argument over another for whatever reason, and that's unfortunate. Really that should only happen if the teams have given you nothing else. But otherwise, yeah, you try to look for something else. There's a question that in a case of a bad match room where the arguments are underanalyzed and the case running parallel, how do you weigh the arguments without completing arguments for them? Good question. Okay, so you don't, so this is the first thing, the obvious thing to say is you should not complete arguments for teams, right? For the obvious reason that different judges will complete it differently from each other, and that just becomes you debating, not judging. To be honest, I think judging lower ranked teams is probably harder than judging higher ranked rooms, for this exact reason that often arguments are just underanalyzed. I think you have to do the same thing. But ultimately, but what you're doing doesn't change, right? You're still looking for reasons for why something is more probable, is worse, and it is about a group that you care more. You're still looking for those three things. And I think it's perhaps, some people would say it's a bit lazy, and maybe it is, but when I'm judging a bad room, a very bad debate, sometimes it's just one thing. Like literally, one opening government said nothing. Like they provided no reasons for why something is likely to be true. Opening opposition came up and they provided one reason that wasn't very strong. It was a weak reason, but they provided one reason, and I'll just give it to them, right? Because one reason, however weak, is still better than no reasons at all. So you're doing the same thing, but you just have to be a bit more careful at finding those reasons that the teams provide. You'll just have to pay a bit more attention, be very careful with your notes that you've picked up all this stuff. And I think probably these are the kind of rooms where people get most pissed at you, because they'll think they've completed the argument, but you also be very careful. If someone says there will be loads of collateral damage, and that is the extent of their argument, I wouldn't credit that argument, because I don't know why I should care more about collateral damage compared to other arguments in the debate. And B, I just don't know what collateral means. Does collateral mean 100 people will die, or does it mean 100,000 people will die? If it's 100, it's very bad, but I'm still willing to live with that depending on what the other side says. So again, in bad rooms, you have to be very honest with teams that their analysis just didn't exist. Just try very hard not to complete it for them. For them. Any other questions on this?
I have a question. Like, for example, if closings are bringing in an extension that is mainly just principle, then it's very well analyzed, but how do you weigh that against the content brought up by opening that's more like practical or consequentialist, without being, really dismissive of the principal argument?
Yeah, good question. I think it goes without saying, I think there's a pretty big bias towards practical arguments in general on the circuit, Pakistan and international, everywhere really. But I think good judging is not having a bias towards either practical or principle. It is saying, both are equally important. It just depends on the debate. I think if opening government makes a very good practical case and closing government makes a very good principle case, but closing government doesn't explain why the principle is more important than the practical, then what you're doing is what we discussed earlier, which is how do we weigh diagonals, which is to say the team that comes second, the team in the lower half, has more of a burden to explain why theirs is more important, right? So you wouldn't say, yeah, ye principle tha, ye practical tha. That doesn't matter. What matters is that the second team just didn't bother explaining why theirs is more important. And that's a valid reason for not giving them the win, because they didn't, they just didn't fulfill their role, which was to explain why they're more important than the team in top half. I guess the more difficult part of your question is, if opening government has a principal claim and then opening opposition has a practical argument, what do you do then, right? If it's directly opposing each other. It's a very difficult question to answer. I think you just have to see how the debate pans out. I don't think you can say, oh, this is a principle, so it doesn't matter. But the one thing I will say, it really does depend on the debate, right? So for instance, if it's an international relations debate, IR debate, right? If it's about military intervention, if it's about it's about war or something to that effect, and someone says there's a responsibility to protect, there's a principal reason for why we should intervene. I guess actually maybe I should take a step back and explain why most principal arguments aren't actually principled. So when you're listening to a principal argument such as responsibility to protect, which is to say, we should intervene in Syria because there's a responsibility to protect Syrian civilians against the atrocities committed by Bashar al-Assad and his soldiers. That's the principal argument. But it's not really a principal argument if you think about it. It's not principle. It's a practical argument. It is saying we should intervene in Syria to improve the lives of Syrian people. That's a practical benefit, right? So automatically, if opening opposition comes up and says, hang on, you're talking about our responsibility to protect, but if we intervene, you'll have all of this collateral damage, you won't succeed, the war will just get worse, you'll eventually leave, and the Syrians will be in a worse situation. So opening government's argument was, we should intervene to help Syrians, but never actually explain why intervention would lead to helping them. And OO just comes up and gives a very straightforward practical case of why intervention will be very bad for Syrians. So the first thing I would say is be very careful in identifying whether an argument is in fact principled. If the argument is, another example is privacy, we have a right to privacy because it allows us to live our lives the way we want to. We're not afraid of being watched and being judged for what we're doing. That is not a principled argument if you think about it. It's actually a practical argument, right? Because it is saying that if we have privacy, we can do the things that we'd otherwise be scared of doing. So our lives get better if we have privacy. That's very much a practical argument. So the first thing I would say is, always be very skeptical when someone says this is a principal argument. 9 times out of 10, it probably won't be a principal argument. It'll just be a practical argument for whatever reason called as a principal one. So that makes your life a lot easier, right? Because then you could just say, guys, actually this was a practical one and this is how we weighed it up. If it's a genuine principal argument, it's like a moral obligation of some form, you should give it equal credibility to a practical argument, and you should just allow the teams to weigh it up. If the teams fail to completely weigh up and the arguments just happen to be equally strong, and like I said, 9 times out of 10, they won't be equally strong. Kuch na kuch hoga that you can use to weigh one team over the other. But if it happens, then you do what you would do if it were 2 practical arguments, which is, as a panel, unfortunately, you'd have to intervene, and then you end up coming down on one side over the other. But then you'd be very frank in your oral adjudication and say, guys, this is why I had to intervene, because you gave me nothing else to go on. But if a principle and a practical are equally, you can just trade that, you just weigh them off, like wash ho jata hai, and then you find something else to weigh them up. Does that make sense?
It does. It's very helpful. Thanks.
So I have a question regarding this. What do you think is like appropriate weighing? Like, what does the team making the principal argument have to do to show that their principle is more important than the practical for you to prioritize?
Sorry, can you say that again, Asan?
Just asking what's appropriate in weighing. Like, what does the team have to do to show that their principle is more important than the practical, so that as a judge you can then put it over the other?
I mean, now you're basically just asking me how you make a principal argument. It's probably not a very good question to ask me because I was never very good at them. Yeah, so I think, in my opinion, vast majority of principal arguments tend to be about moral obligations. So reciprocal obligations, like you owe someone because someone else did something for you. So regardless of whether it is good for you or good for them, you just owe them something. So parents and with children, for instance, state towards civilians, for instance, that sort of thing. And I think ultimately what ends up happening is you kind of have to you end up giving intuition pumps when you're making principal arguments to say, okay, let me just put this out to you. If, and this is an open house question, right? Anyone can answer this. If it was proved, right? If it was proved that slavery actually led to an improvement in the lives of certain people, right? Like their economic, social life, their lives, just that the quality of life would improve if they entered into slavery. Would any of you legalize slavery? Okay, so no one said yes, right? But and presumably here, and Asher, some people are saying no in the chat room. So it seems like no one would legalize slavery, even if it was proven beyond a doubt that slavery would lead to the improvement in the quality of life of whoever would enter into slavery, right? And Vahase, it should sort of hit you that your opposition to slavery is not just a practical one of people lived atrocious, horrible lives where they were abused, etc. It's also just the principal opposition to being so subservient and having no freedom, no liberty at all. So I think ultimately what happens is someone in the debate will have to provide you with some kind of intuitive pump similar to that. That's obviously relevant to the debate because the slavery one doesn't always work, which makes you realize, oh, actually, you know what, this moral obligation should exist regardless of its practical benefits. But again, it's very debate dependent, and it's very hard to sort of give a general answer to that. Does that make sense, Hassan?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, there's a question that was sent in the chat to me privately, so I'll just read that out for everyone. According to many judges, closing side wins over opening if they even have one valid extension. According to these judges, the job of an opening team is to not let closing come up with any extension whatsoever, right? So the question is, if an opening team does not run every single thing they could possibly have run, right, they lose. That's just stupid. I don't know who says this. This is wrong. The openings team is not to deprive closing of a valid extension. The opening's job is just to have a case which is stronger than the closing's case. That's it. That's it. Anything on that one? Just whoever sent me that, do they have a follow-up question to that? Nope. Okay. Any other question on this sort of how to weigh up two distinct principal arguments? No. Okay. There's someone, I think Noor Malik sent something in the chat, so I'm just going to if everyone could sort of read that, and then we can try and answer that one as well. Noor, could you just sort of explain your question? I'm not sure I understood. Okay, Zed, just sort of your, can you explain the question? I don't think I understood it. Do we have Noor?
Yeah, hi, I'm here. So
hello?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Right. So if the opening claims a certain impact, for example, they'd say there's going to be an increase in numbers for a certain movement, but they don't tell me why numbers are going to be beneficial for, let's say, the motion or whatever it claims for, say. But the closing comes proving me that it's going to be primarily very good. Does the closing take it over the opening because their argument lies on an assumption that they did not prove?
Yeah, that's
because
a good question. Yeah.
Right. So because that happens in most debates, that closing brings up content that does not remain relevant to the debate, but is actually very crucial to the openings that they do not substantiate their claim to.
Sure, that's a good question. So I guess if I understand that correctly, if I could just sort of repeat that to you, opening government comes up and says, this policy is very good because what it will do is it will lead to more people joining, let's say, the feminist movement, and that's a very good thing. But then they never actually prove why more people joining the feminist movement is a good thing. Closing government comes up and says, more numbers are good because that means more numbers on the streets when people come out and protest, which puts more pressure on politicians, which can lead to legislative change. You can lobby more people, you have more people to convince, you get media coverage, that sort of thing. Is that sort of your question, Noor?
Yes, sort of.
Yeah. So if you have that kind of a split where opening says we get more numbers, but then doesn't actually prove why that's a good thing, and then closing proves why that's a good thing, I would go for closing, right? And the reason is because, like you said yourself, Noor, opening never actually explain why what they are achieving is something that we should achieve in the first place, right? Like, it's not at all obvious. I mean, maybe it is obvious, but nonetheless, you shouldn't weigh in yourself and give them the credit as to why numbers are a good thing. They have to go that extra step. I think it is completely valid for closing team to come up and say, opening said that as a result of this policy, we would achieve X, but let us tell you why X actually matters. That is a perfectly valid extension, and you can give it to that closing team over their opening team. Does that make sense?
Yes. So, sorry, can I ask a follow-up thing on this?
Yeah.
Right. So if the closing, for example, let's say the openings case is premised on why cinema is going to, let's say these are the benefits of what that narrative is saying, but let's say closing comes up and tells the importance of cinema, or let's say films, etc. So, but most of the cases that I've seen is that remains no longer relevant to the debate as it evolves, and it doesn't engage with what the others are saying. That most of the judges that I have seen do not credit them as bringing in or proving that content that is premised, that is the opening's premised argument or assumption. So closing proving that does not give them benefit over that. They usually rank fourth in that round because their argument, they say, is not engaging enough with the other arguments in the debate.
Okay. So I think the first thing I want to do is Noor, you said this sort of line a couple of times now, which is their argument was no longer relevant to the debate. I want to make one thing very clear, which is to say, no team ever falls out of a debate. Ye nahi hota ki, opening government sort of has this case about something, and then all three other teams decide that they actually want to argue about something else. They want to make the debate about a different issue, and then opening government just becomes irrelevant. That's not how it works. There's no more or less relevant arguments necessarily in a debate. It's just what the teams are able to prove. So in that instance, if opening government says something, and the debate progresses in a way that argument doesn't get a lot of responses, doesn't get a lot of attention, maybe even the DPM doesn't talk about it that much, the Deputy Prime Minister, and CG decides that's the thing they want to piggyback on. That's the thing that they want to sort of provide an extension on. That is fine. It is not on the judge to come in and say, actually, guys, what you chose as your extension was not super relevant, wasn't what everyone else was talking about. It is for the team to prove why it is relevant, and then it is for other teams to respond to it. Ye nahi ho sakta ki ek speaker ek achhi argument de de, they give a good argument, and then everyone just ignores it, and therefore that team loses. If anything, that will mean that team probably wins because they just made an argument that is decent and it got ignored. Does that sort of address your question, Noor?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
No worries. Anyone else?
Asad, if I may, on the earlier half of this discussion, so wouldn't you still go for the closings when you flip the what the opening does and the closing does? So even if, for example, the opening half communicates all the potential benefits of greater support for any movement, and then impacts it very well, and then the closing comes in and mechanizes it and actually proves to us why the support is coming in. In that circumstance, now we've just flipped the earlier who's doing what from the earlier discussion. In that discussion, wouldn't you still end up going for the closing? Because in this case, the closing would be like, we've mechanized it and we're actually proving why it's going to happen.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think odds are yes. It is very rare, though, that a team will exclusively talk about why something is good and just not at all pay attention to why it will happen, right? Mostly you will have the team spend some time on both. They'll end up focusing more on one thing than the other, right? The teams will focus more on why it's a good thing, less on why they'll get a lot more people, but they'll still provide one or two reasons. So I think it's usually a bit more nuanced than that. So usually you'll have to kind of go into the weeds a bit more and say, Acha, opening government explained to us why getting more people is an excellent thing. And they had these two, not very strong, but they still had two reasons as to why we will actually get more numbers. Closing government does an excellent job of proving why we will get more numbers, but does absolutely nothing on why that's a good thing, right? So in that instance, you're probably leaning towards opening government because they crushingly won one issue, which is why having more numbers is a good thing. And they did a bit of work, not very good, but they did a bit of work on why we will get more numbers, whereas closing government only touched on one issue and didn't even touch the other one. So I think it will depend on how it comes across, like what is actually said in the debate. But just take your questions at literally, which is to say, if opening government just argues having more people in movements is an excellent thing, and closing government just argues here's why we will have lots of people, you will, or at least I will, lean towards closing government, assuming closing government actually explains why their argument is more important. Like you don't just default to them. Like closing government has to actually say, look, fair enough that there are loads of benefits for opening, as opening government explains, of getting more people, but they never actually prove that the benefit would occur, right? And that is the premise. That's like a step first that they had to prove. We've come in and done that for you, which means that the benefits opening government talk about will actually occur. So you're explaining why yours comes first, like why yours is more important. Without that explanation, I would not give it to closing government. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay, what is the next one? To what extent can a principal argument be credited? At what point does the principle prove enough benefit? So I think this goal, very short answer, we've already touched on this, which is the principle is as important as a practical argument. It should be. People don't make it very well. And like we said, mostly principal arguments end up being practical ones. But if it's a genuine principal argument, it is as strong as a practical argument is. So yeah, that's the sort of short answer. What constitutes as distinct analysis from your opening? I consider this straightforward. One, completely new argument to what opening said. Second is same argument, but just new reasons for why it is true, or why it is likely to happen, or why it is so good or bad, right? So those are sort of broadly or entirely new thing, or just adding more reasons to what has already been said. I guess what some teams sometimes do is they'll say, you know what, we're going to take all of opening government's analysis, everything they said, and we're just going to explain why it affects someone else. But here's why all of this analysis doesn't just affect the one group opening government we're talking about. It actually also affects all this other group that we care more about. That's weak. That's much more weak, because what you're taking the argumentation of opening government and just saying, oh, look here, it also impacts this minority, not just this minority, right? So that's also, I guess, an extension technically, but that's a much weaker one, because you're not adding anything new. You're just explaining how the arguments already made affect someone else. But yeah, that's sort of the straightforward answer. Any questions on that? Oh, okay.
Yeah, I have one confusion in this. So
Yeah.
let's assume opening does a lot of hard work, like they give all the analysis, they prove everything, and they prove like a big impact. Their closing comes and just comes up with a bigger impact. They say, all right, we agree with everything opening said, and we buy all of their analysis. The only thing we're going to do is just provide a bigger impact. Do they then take it over opening as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think, again, it does depend on what's being said in the debate, but just to take your question very literally, if all they do is say, here's a bigger impact that occurs as a result of all the analysis given by opening government, they can't really win the debate, right? Because for something to happen, so they say X will happen and X is very bad, right? But we first need the reasons for why X will happen. And if those have already been provided, those are exactly the same as opening governments, it becomes very hard for closing government to win. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so but I still don't. So and this then links with the previous question that openings gave all the analysis, but then closing just proved why the analysis is important. So like a sort of similar thing is happening here, but rather than just proving why it's important, they're proving why it's more important. So like where do you sort of draw the line, or how do you differentiate between the two?
I mean, there isn't necessarily a clear line, I think, and it isn't necessarily obvious as to which of the two you should prioritize. So the two being, is something going to happen, and if it happens, is how good or bad it is, right? So is the feminist movement going to get lots more followers And if it does get lots more followers, is that actually a very good thing? If how good a thing is that actually substantially? So it's not obvious to me, anyways, as to which should intuitively be more important in a debate. I think it literally will just depend which team explains. So I think what I was saying to Zed earlier, which is if the closing team provides something new, does one of the two things that the opening government didn't do, but then also goes a second step further and explains why what they've done is more important, then you can give it to them. If they just do something new and it isn't super obvious on the face why it is better than what opening government did, I would struggle to give it to them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes sense. Thanks.
I think to some extent you guys have to just be careful. Just be careful when judging is you need to let the teams make the comparisons for you, right? You're not really making for. So a lot of these questions, obviously, you guys they're very fair questions, but you're asking, what do we do if opening government says this, and what do we do if closing government says this? 9 times out of 10, it should hopefully, once you follow the debates, it should be obvious who is more important than the other ones. But you should just leave it to the teams to do it for you, right? And if they don't do it for you, right, then if there's literally, it's just not obvious and they've not done it for you, like I said, it often just ends up defaulting to opening government. So don't be afraid to sort of tell teams, like, look, I couldn't come up with a good way of weighing this because one was not provided to me, and that's why this ended up defaulting to opening. Right. Does any other questions?
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so I just want to ask on this distinction between opening and closing, and if the reasons are different. For example, the closing just gives more reasons for why something is likely to happen. So does that favor closing then?
So I think this is I feel this is the same question. So if a closing government provides more reasons for why something is likely to happen, I think it will depend, right? So what does more mean? So opening government provided 2 reasons for why something has happened. They're decent arguments, right? Closing government provides 3 reasons, much stronger, as to why these arguments about why this thing will occur, right? Why they're true. I think it's fair to say that that is not the only argument in the debate. It's very unlikely that both opening government and closing government will have just that going for them, right? What often ends up happening is, let's say opening government has 3 arguments, closing government has 2 arguments, right? Well, opening government की पहली argument है, why is this true? Closing government की पहली argument is the same, but they provide better reasons, right? On that, you can say, fine. Closing government's first argument was stronger, much better developed than opening government's first argument. But then you also have 2 other arguments from opening government and 1 other argument from closing government to weigh up, right? So it is very unlikely that the debate will just hinge on one argument versus 1 argument, because there will be other stuff in there as well. So it probably makes sense to sort of say, and I guess the other thing is, and there will be some difference in how each judge looks at it, but you have to ask yourself, how much stronger are these reasons, right? So I don't know, for instance, let's say opening government says the reason why we get more people, well, the reason why it is a good thing to have more people in the feminist movement is because you get more media coverage, and more media coverage puts more pressure on politicians. Closing government comes up and says more people means more people who can sign petitions, more people who can knock on doors, and more people who can lobby their MPs to pass different laws, right? So that puts pressure on politicians. Why is one more important than the other? Like, why is more media coverage that leads to pressure, or is more lobbying that leads to more pressure by citizens? Which one is better, right? It's not super obvious to me. So while closing government has provided a completely new argument, closing government has to go through the extra step of explaining why that new reason is a more important reason than the one that's been provided so far. If they don't do that, I would just give it to opening government, because it's not your job to weigh that up. And on the face of it, both reasons seem pretty equal or fair. But also what you could otherwise do is you could say, guys, look, on this argument, you both provided one reason each, seemed equally powerful, became a wash. Let's look at what the other things you said were. Here's how they weighed up. Does that make sense?
Yep, that makes it clear. Thank you.
Anyone else? I think Tanya has asked a question. Tanya, do you want to ask the question here?
That question was answered. I just wanted to ask if, because my concern is more with bad match rooms because they're significantly harder to judge when you are a novice judge yourself. In a case where a team is arguing over something that's technically a fallacy, however, that fallacy has not been called out by other teams, how do you weigh that, or do you dismiss it completely?
Okay, so what, I mean, do you want to give me an example of a fallacy you're talking about? Do you have one in mind?
I don't necessarily have. This mostly happens with young boys debating on feminism.
Okay, well, that's a very specific group of people debating on a very specific thing. I mean, is there something you've heard before on a feminism debate?
I think I blacked that out.
I think it depends, honestly. It's very hard to answer that question in the abstract. I guess if your question is, I mean, is your question about fallacies, or is your question, what if someone is making an absurd argument? Maybe there's no difference between the two. I don't know. But yeah, is sort of your question about the second or the latter, that the argument is just pretty absurd on the face of it?
The argument is pretty absurd.
Yeah, so so this is good. So the first debate I judged, the first university debate I judged in Pakistan was a feminism debate about women praying in mosques next to men and women being able to lead namaz. And opening opposition ran the argument that women standing next to men will distract men because women are pretty, women will have perfume on them, men will smell that perfume, and then they will get distracted. That is an absurd argument, in my opinion, and I just discredited that entirely. Closing opposition ran the argument that women are made from the rib of man, and therefore they cannot stand next to them. That was also an absurd argument. So I think if that is the sort of thing you're talking about, I would just discredit those arguments entirely, because they're just stupid. And fair enough that to some extent there may be disagreement between judges as to what is absurd and what is not, and then that's just something that has to be hashed out. But I think, if you are talking about the kind of things that I've just given you examples about, then on the face of it, you can just say, like, this is just nonsense and this doesn't count. Is that the kind of thing you were talking about, Tanya?
Kind of.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very difficult. It really depends on the situation. I think if both sides are making absurd arguments, and you just kind of have to take them on the face of it, right? You can't just discredit everything. But I think if one side just makes absurd arguments of the sort that I just sort of referenced, and the other side is much more reasonable, then I think it becomes quite obvious as to what you should do, which is give the debate to the side that is more obvious. Yeah. Any other questions?
Actually, I had a question.
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so there's often this scenario in BP debating where if you are OG, your PM sets up a good case, but the LO does not rebut it or establish a clash. However, your TPM comes up and then he reinforces your arguments, presents new arguments, right? But then DLO, being the killjoy, he completely wrecks your case. So there are some judges who say that OG should win on default because they do not have a chance to reply, or there are some judges who say that, oh, teams should be judged as independent like units, and then we should pay up at the end, right? So I, in my personal experience, have lost and won uh, debates on the very same reason, right? There have been often these circumstances where I've won debates on this particular thing and I've also lost them, right? So how do you judge in such a position, right, where like the LO is unimpressive while DLO kind of wrecks you up?
I mean, sucks, but if a DLO wrecks opening government, then a DLO wrecks opening government. I think Euros 2017 the European Championships in 2017, the chief adjudicators tried to rewrite the rules about this, but it never really caught on, and everyone after that was just like, this is nonsense. I think the going rule, at least, I haven't judged in a year and a half, but I don't think anything's changed since then. But back then it was the same. If a DLO is by far the most impressive speaker of the top 4 speakers, and they've just taken a wrecking ball to opening government, then that's just harsh. But opening opposition should win. And I think the rule for that is pretty similar. It's pretty obvious in that DLO is no different from the opposition whip towards CG, right? But then you may as well not have an opposition whip, but which also doesn't sound fair. But I think while it is true that, and I think this is a good way of thinking about it, while it is true that opening opposition has the last word on top half, right? It is also true that Prime Minister spends 7 minutes just proving their case, right? Prime Minister has to do no rebuttal. Leader of opposition has to do some rebuttal and then has to spend time proving their case. So there's a double burden. So if you just look at the time spent on substantive, right, by both speakers on each side, opening government always, or vast majority of cases, tends to spend more time proving their case because they have an entire 7-minute speech which has no rebuttals either. So yes, OO has more chance to respond, but opening government has more of an opportunity to establish their case. So it actually balances out fine, in my opinion. Hopefully, does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Cool. Any other questions? Right. Hopefully, if not, I think, yeah. I mean, obviously, if anyone has any other questions that come up, just message me or message Essen or one of the others and they can let me know. But yeah, hopefully this was helpful. I think there is a proper scale actually, which I can send to Essen and he can perhaps distribute it, which explains why certain speeches should fit into specific bands. And that would be much more helpful for everyone than sort of me going over what is a 75 or what is an 80. But otherwise, I think the questions are sort of largely similar to what's already been covered. If anyone doesn't think that, if anyone has a new question, by all means, ask now. Otherwise, I think we're done.
Too. I think it's quite basic, but it's worth that you like reiterate it. So like, what should be the judging criteria? Should a judge be a tabula rasa who knows nothing, who cannot like exceed the bounds of the debate, or should he be someone who like has an average kind of a knowledge, or is he someone that that person is like intellectually sound or something like? Can you reiterate that?
Yeah, I mean, the going rule is, and I forget the exact words, but it's sort of the judge is your average, reasonable, well-informed human being. I don't know what that means, if I'm perfectly honest, but I think someone who reads sort of the headlines every day. So I'll give you an example maybe to make it more clear. So I think I was judging a debate once where someone said, if enough people protested, Netanyahu would stop expanding into the West Bank, right? Now, that's just sort of on the face of it, but silly, simply because people have protested and the argument was, if the international community comes out and tells Netanyahu to stop expanding settlements in the West Bank, Netanyahu will stop doing that. That is just sort of false on the face of it, because the international community is against expansion in the West Bank and it hasn't stopped Netanyahu, right? In Israel. So I think to some extent, you just have to, if you know for a fact something is wrong, then it's wrong. You shouldn't credit it. But equally, you shouldn't go in So that's a false statement. Like it's like a lie, right? So that's one category. But I think other than, if there's a lie there, saying, wading in, saying, I have expert knowledge, I know that the situation in Venezuela is actually not like this, so a coup would be very bad. That's wrong, right? You shouldn't go in as sort of like an expert on something. You just have whatever average reasonable information means. But my base standard usually is, if someone's not lying through their teeth, right, I just sort of let them get on with it. I will just judge on what they've told me. So if they say something like, China will have more hegemony in Southeast Asia, and that is obviously bad if you look at the Uyghur situation, I will not give them very much credit, because they kind of have to explain what the Uyghur situation is, even if it's in just a couple of sentences. So hopefully that sort of makes sense, right? But you shouldn't just sort of drop saying, oh, look at the Uyghur situation. You're going to have to actually explain what the Uyghur situation is. Does that sort of make sense?
Yeah, it's slightly vague, but it would suffice.
Yeah, unfortunately, it is a bit vague. I'm afraid it really does depend. I think, do not go in as an expert. Certainly do not go in thinking one side is just factually correct than the other. But unless you hear clear falsehood, which you should just eliminate, right? Just let the teams get on with what they're saying, in my opinion. I think we've had more questions in the chat. If someone says something very controversial in a debate but backs it up with proper analysis, would you still credit it? For instance, is someone trying to justify the Holocaust, or just saying something that an educated person wouldn't or shouldn't say? I mean, if someone tried to justify the Holocaust, I think you should just tell them to stop speaking. It's probably not okay, because, I mean, I don't think you can. So if someone says something very controversial and justifies it, it really does depend on what the controversial statement is, right? The controversial statement could be, here's why Trump is actually better for America, right? That's fine. If you want to prove it, you can go ahead and try and prove it, right? And then you should listen to the reasons. Maybe the reasons are Republicans are better on economy, I don't know, whatever, right? But if the controversial statement is, the Holocaust never happened, or the Holocaust was a good thing, then that's just stupid, and you should just shut it down immediately. That shouldn't be allowed. How do you identify in universe and out universe debates when the motion doesn't specify that particularly? Ariha, I don't think I understand your question. What do you mean in and out of universe? Do we have Ariha on the call? So, right. I mean, does anyone else know what in universe and...
They say that we have technology in which we can go to this planet or set up a new civilization, etc.
No, actually, she means like debates which are set in a particular fictional universe, like specifically talking about a character in a universe.
Or like Harry Potter world or Star Wars, something.
Yep.
I mean, how do you identify those debates? I mean, the motion has to say that very clearly. The motion has to say, something along the lines of, this house as Harry Potter would, do X. So that implies you're Harry Potter in the Harry Potter world, or assuming that the debate takes place in the fictional realm set up by J.K. Rowling, this house would whatever. So the motion has to be very clear that it is in that universe. You can't take a normal sounding motion. And so, for instance, I think I was once in a debate which was, this house regrets Lara Croft. And for those of you who don't know, Lara Croft is sort of, was based on was initially a character in a game, a bunch of movies about her as well. She's this, she's effectively, how do I explain this? She basically goes to ruins, ends up killing lots of people, just like an action game / movie. She kills lots of people, kills lots of animals who are out to kill her, and then just sort of finds these hidden gems and ruins and artifacts and sort of brings them back. Now, opening government decided that they wanted to regret Lara Croft, not because of the way she is depicted in games and movies, but they wanted to regret Lara Croft in the actual universe of Tomb Raider, which is sort of the games and the movies what they're called. That that can't work. You can't just take a normally phrased motion, which is that we regret the existence of a very, sexualized character, and then say we regret her because of what she does in her own universe. The motion has to be very clear in saying, assuming we exist in this universe, this house would X. So hopefully, I mean, I'm hoping that was the question you answered, the question you asked, and I've answered it. Do you have any tips regarding OA? How do you structure it? Gets better with practice, to be honest. There's no, I don't really have to, I guess one thing I would say is don't forget to do all the clashes. I think so what some people do, and even I sometimes still do, I forget to do the last diagonals. I'll do opening government versus opening opposition. I'll explain closing government. And then, I'll just forget closing up, because on closing opposition, you have to explain all three, right? You have to explain why they lose to or beat opening opposition, closing government, and opening government. I will sometimes forget to do one of those clashes. I'll maybe do one, or I'll maybe do two. If it's super obvious, I'll definitely forget to do all three. But please remember to do each clash for each team. But other than that, and to be honest, I don't really have many tips on oral adjudication. I think it just gets something that just gets better over time. I think to my notes wali baat ki thi, my third sheet where I have like sort of split them into 4 sections and I have the titles. It's usually, I find it useful to go through each argument. I find it useful to say, look, opening government had 3 arguments. These arguments just didn't make sense or sort of didn't have any analysis to them, so we didn't credit them at all, so I'm going to get rid of them. And then these are the arguments that we then sort of discussed. This is how they weighed up against the 4 arguments that opening opposition gave. And then I just sort of trace them. So I guess there's that. That's going to be my one tip. Other than that, I don't really have much to say. Tanya asked, could you please explain how scoring scales are used? I don't know if you asked this before or after I said, but I'm going to send a scale to Essen, who can sort of forward this scale with a description of the speeches, and that should make clear 69. But otherwise, yes, a 69 is a very low score, and it probably means that the speaker really has not said much, or just said really bizarre, abstract things that are just very confusing.